You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Examined Life with Phil. I actually had a good deal of trouble trying to figure out what I was going to do the podcast on this week. I went back and forth on probably 3 or 4 different topics. I've got all kinds of notes written up on various things where I thought, well, maybe I could do something on the philosophy of story, maybe I could do something on issues surrounding transgenderism and several other things like that, but none of them just really seemed to be clicking with me. None of them seemed to be the kind of thing where I was like, yeah, that's something I want to spend an hour or so talking about this week. I mean, not that those 2 examples or other things are unimportant issues, but if I'm going to do a podcast where you're going to listen to it for an hour, I'd rather it be something where I just kind of feel the need to talk about it, and I'm sure you would too. I found it really, really helps when people are doing things, if they're doing it something that they're passionate about, that they're really putting effort into. And none of those things were things that I felt like I really wanted to put effort into. Maybe at some other point, but not right now. Just a quick, easy example. This is earlier this week. I was watching the DVD I've got of Metallica's first S&M concert, where they played with the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra and incorporated a symphony orchestra sound with their rock music, which I absolutely love. I think it's one of the best albums I've ever heard, honestly. And it's okay if you disagree. Well, I was listening to it because watching the DVD because they have another one coming out, and I was getting kind of excited for it, and I was telling my wife, I think one of the reasons why this is such good music is when you watch Metallica perform at that concert on the DVD, or I think you can find videos of it on YouTube, they're really, really, really into the music. They're just absolutely loving what they're doing. They're so incredibly passionate about the music they're playing. And even when you don't necessarily see that, when you're just listening to the album, that comes through. That really improves the overall quality of what they're doing. I saw another concert one time, again, I think because they're putting up lots of concerts on YouTube these days, where it was very clear they weren't into it. And you could, even though it's still Metallica, still playing their music, you could hear it. It wasn't as good because, and I think part of it is they just weren't into it. So likewise, I don't want to subject all you guys to a podcast where I'm just not into it. So I was struggling, going back and forth on what I was going to do this podcast about, and while I was doing that and thinking about these things, I came across 2 things that kind of pushed me in a direction. So the first of those things is, I came across the Joe Rogan podcast where he talks to Edward Snowden, and as I'm sure pretty much everybody who's listening is aware, Edward Snowden was the guy who formerly worked for the NSA and CIA and an intermix of those agencies for the U.S. government, who sort of blew the whistle on a lot of their data collection programs and how they were and probably still are effectively spying on American citizens without warrants. Now, the way he went about that is, I think, still highly, highly questionable, but that's who he was and what he did, and he's now over in Russia somewhere, because if he comes back to the U.S., he's going to immediately get tried, and he doesn't think he's going to get a fair shake if he gets tried. So anyhow, he was doing a whole podcast with Joe Rogan, and obviously they were talking over the internet. And Snowden is telling his story about how he got into working in the intelligence agencies in IT, and how he came across all these the evidence that this stuff was going on, and how he came across the evidence and documentation that these mass surveillance, essentially spying on U.S. citizens, mostly using phone records and things along those lines. And as he's telling his story, so to speak, Snowden gets into the details of how this is going on, and the details of how not only is it illegal, but the people who were doing it almost certainly knew it was illegal and did it anyway, and in cases where they could, knew they were doing something illegal, and then they pressured Congress to change the law so it wouldn't be illegal anymore, and many, many other things like that. And really what he's building up to is his case for why he couldn't go through the so-called proper channels to out this and get it changed, because everybody who was in the proper channels knew it was going on, knew it was wrong, and was still doing it anyway. At least that's the case he makes anyhow. And this isn't exactly relevant to what caught my attention about this, but you could probably make a decent case that he's right. We've definitely seen enough government incompetence and how the government likes to pass the buck and likes to not hold itself accountable in the last 10 or 20 years to say, yeah, that's a plausible story. I don't know, or I'm not in a position to know or have the evidence that what he's saying is totally accurate, but he's at least telling a plausible story. So give the guy who I've called a traitor before a little credit for telling a plausible story, at least. But anyhow, what caught my attention and got me thinking is that the real problem that he's describing there is that there has to be a Terminator. And here I don't mean the killer robot cyborg from the future. What I mean is there has to be a way to stop. There has to be like some force that pushes back when the NSA, the CIA, and other government intelligence agencies decide we're going to gather all this data, even though we know we shouldn't do it, even though we know it's a violation of the Constitution, even though we should be getting warrants and we're not getting warrants, etc., etc. There has to be a Terminator, something that stops them from going too far. There has to be a line they reach that they can't go further than, or at the very least, you want a force that pushes back so there's give and take, like the NSA is constantly pushing to get more information and more surveillance, but there's another force pushing back it's in that force's interest to say, no, you can't do this, no further, and so on and so forth. And what Snowden was saying is, there is none of that. And the things that you would think would be in place to be that Terminator, to be that check, aren't working because it's actually in the interests of those people who should be the check on these things to not do anything about it. Like he gave the example of how, in theory, the press should be pushing back against a lot of this, but it's actually in the interest of a lot of the press to not do anything about it because they need access to people in the government for their news agencies and news stories and things like that. And if they push too hard at the government, well, the Congress and White House could, at least in theory, say, we're not giving you interviews anymore. Or, for example, all of these agencies he's describing are in the executive branch, so in theory they answer to the president, and the president changes every 4 or 8 years, depending on how elections go. So in theory, they should be answerable to the president. But these various institutions and the people who work in them have been in place so long that when the president comes in, they more or less say to him, here's what's going on, here's what we want you to do. And by the time you get to be a president, you're used to enough political horse trading that you're probably going to say, I could give them what they want. And if you're a smart president, you can see how if the intelligence agencies have it out for you, even though technically they work for you, they can make your life as president very, very difficult. They can make your presidency very, very difficult, even if they can't quite exactly push you out of office. And I think we've seen a pretty good example of that in how a lot of the U.S. intelligence agencies have made Donald Trump's life and presidency very, very difficult. And he didn't exactly start off his presidency by being very friendly with them. He was actually very, very skeptical of a lot of the things they were saying and really putting them down. And I don't know this for sure, but it seems pretty likely that a lot of them have pushed back and made his life and his presidency very, very difficult. So the new president comes in, he's a smart guy, he knows all that, and so the intelligence agencies come to him and basically say, this is what we want, but lurking behind it is the demand of, we could make your life difficult. And on top of that, they're usually going to say, and 90% of what we want from you is going to be classified anyway, so it's highly doubtful anybody here will ever find out, and if they do, you're going to be long gone from being president. You'll probably be dead, because usually the statute of limitations on releasing information like that is something like 75 years. So why don't you just give us what you want? That's the path of least resistance. So who wouldn't take the path of least resistance in that situation? So the Snowden's argument is the president doesn't serve as a terminator on it there either. So that was the main point I took away from Rogan's interview with Snowden there, is there's this problem of mass surveillance that the rise in the technological age has enabled, and now the government can more or less do what it wants, classify what it's doing, and pretty much for the most part get away with it by just classifying all the illegal things it does. And it's now very, very difficult for any part of the U.S. electorate to hold them accountable, because the people actually doing it aren't elected, And it's in the interest of the people who are elected to blink their eyes, cover it up, and just pretend it isn't there. It's going to take a rare, rare individual with a lot of integrity and a lot of strength of will to stand up and say, no, that's wrong, that's a violation of the Constitution, and if you want to do that, we need to pass constitutional amendments in order to do that. Almost certainly that's not going to happen, even though that would be the right way to go about it. And here are two other slightly different, but I'm sure you can see kind of similar examples of how this works. The first one that comes to mind is I was talking to a good friend of mine about the ongoing problems that are with as far as like which statue should be taken down. Should you take down the statue of that Confederate general, but not Thomas Jefferson, even though Thomas Jefferson owned slaves and the Confederate general was in some senses fighting for the right to own slaves. And I'd mentioned this, I'm pretty sure I've mentioned this conversation I had with him on the podcast before. And what my friend, to his great credit, was saying is there needs to be some kind of consistent standard, because the standards are just all over the place now as to why this statue's staying, why this one's going down. And so he was saying, why don't we make the standard, if that person said or did things that would get them fired from a job today, then their statue or portrait or painting or whatever it is should be taken down. Now, I don't think that's a particularly good standard. I think that's a little too loose. But again, to his credit, he was recognizing there's a problem here. There's no Terminator. There's no endpoint. There's no point. There's no consistent standard by which we can say a statue of Thomas Jefferson is allowed, but not of Robert E. Lee. So he was saying, why don't we come up with this consistent standard? Now, the problem, I think, with his standard is it's too relative, in that it's a relative to the time and context in which we're in now. And that's not always the best way to judge art, especially art from the past. For example, the Taliban could use that standard to justify why they destroyed all kinds of statues of the Buddha in Afghanistan when they took over there. They destroyed some of the, I think, if not the biggest, then some of the biggest Buddhist statues that had ever been constructed. And I'm not a Buddhist, I don't want to worship Buddha, but I would see cultural value in that art nonetheless and not want that to be destroyed. But the Taliban would say, aha, if somebody praises Buddha in our society, that's blasphemy. Therefore, we can destroy those statues. And I want to say, well, no. And so that's I think the problem with that standard is, as cultural norms shift, then you're going to wind up destroying or taking down all this artwork and cultural history, and you don't want to do that either. At least you shouldn't want to do that. And if you follow the news at all, you can see how the lack of a Terminator, the lack of an endpoint, the lack of a point where people can say, okay, yeah, that's enough, is a serious problem for these ongoing kind of social issues. I mean, there have actually been serious articles writing about how the orcs in The Lord of the Rings are racist, because it's a racist or xenophobic presentation of things because the orcs don't seem to have any redeeming qualities in this fantasy novel that was made into a movie that was written about 80 years ago now. Now, that strikes me as, on the face of it, patently ridiculous, but somebody really did argue for that, and you can find various examples of that all over where it's just patently ridiculous. And I'm sure I've mentioned a few of these in the podcast past. So what you need there is you need a way to say, okay, here's where our society was wrong before. This art, this statue, this culture represents how our society was wrong before. So we either need to take it down or recontextualize it in some way so we're no longer honoring and glorifying something that was wrong. Easy example of this, and people like to joke because the Nazis are easy examples, but the Nazis erected all kinds of statues and monuments in their own honor when they were ruling Germany. Well, after they were out of power, the Germans who were around there rightly took them down. And the obvious reason why is because their culture had, fortunately and for the good, moved on and realized, oh, Nazism was bad. We need to take down these things because we don't want to give glory and honor to the Nazis like we used to. So in these current examples with the ongoing issues regarding, well, which statues should we have in prominent places in our government buildings and institutions here in America, I think the appropriate standard, the appropriate Terminator, so to speak, should be, well, what was the author's intention in making that statue and painting that portrait? What were they honoring about the person involved? And in the case of statues and monuments to the Confederates, it seems to me pretty clear that at least most of the time, if not all the time, they were attempting to honor the fight the Confederates made against the Union in their effort to rebel and secede from the Union. Where, say, in the case of, like, the Jefferson Memorial, Jefferson wasn't being honored there because he owned slaves and behaved inappropriately with them and did bad things and treated people dishonestly and poorly in his life. He was actually a pretty big jerk to some people who were his friends at many points. No, he's being honored because he wrote the Declaration of Independence, because he was the third president of the United States, because he did the Louisiana Purchase, and because he was so heavily involved in the founding and start of this country. And you could say the same thing about Dr. Martin Luther King. He has a memorial there in D.C. that's a pretty good memorial. My wife and I saw it when we were there in D.C. Actually, both of the last times we've been to D.C., we went by there. And anyhow, you look into the history of Dr. King's life, he was terrible to women. He treated them awfully. But we're not honoring him with that memorial in D.C. there because of how he treated the women in his life. Rather, we're there honoring him because of how central he was to the civil rights movement and the good that brought about in our country. And so, if somebody were to come along and say, well, in light of the Me Too movement and what we know about how Martin Luther King treated women, we should take this down, I would say, well, no, it's not there because of what he did to women. It's there because of how key he was to the civil rights movement and how all the good he did. And same thing with Jefferson. People say we should take down the Jefferson Memorial. No, it's not there because he owned slaves or because he was a jerk to people and we're trying to honor him for the terrible things he did. We're honoring him because of the great things he did, like writing the Declaration of Independence, like being the third president of the United States who did so much good, and so on and so forth. And so in those cases, I think appealing to the artist or the author's intentions can give us somewhat of a more consistent standard, a more consistent Terminator as to whether or not a piece of artwork or a statue should stay in a prominent place and whether or not the person or group that it's honoring should be honored. Now here's again, different example of how it's problematic when you don't have that end, when you don't have that Terminator, when you don't have a way to say, okay, enough's enough. A few years back, I was at a conference where the keynote speaker was a philosopher who's doing a lot of work on philosophy of disability. He gave, I don't remember exactly, either 2 or 3 talks, and he was the keynote speaker. And I know I was present for 2 of them. He might have given a third one that I was present for as well. I don't remember exactly, but that's not the point. The deal is he was essentially arguing both times, and in slightly different ways both times, that society does not do enough to accommodate disabled people. And he was able to cite some pretty well documented examples of how, like, school boards didn't give special needs students what they were required to give them by law until they were forced to do it. Various committees didn't do the right thing, usually government committees of some kind. And other examples like that, where it was pretty clear that the disabled people in question weren't getting the accommodations they needed, weren't being treated fairly, and were kind of being overlooked. And he acknowledged that most of the time that's probably not malicious. It's just kind of what happens when you have a committee that's trying to work for the good of the most. They'll overlook the good of the few. That is, as I've talked about many, many times on this podcast, when you have a system that works for 98% of people, well, that's amazing, but it still leaves out the 2%. And he was more or less saying, hey, you and people who work in school boards, who are on boards at your church or committees at your church, you're probably inadvertently excluding the disabled people because they have needs and accommodations that are necessary for them that you're not looking at and acknowledging. And most of the time, it's not because you're being malicious or because you hate them, it's just that they're overlooked, and that needs to end. And so the first session he did, when it was Q&A, what I asked him is I said, okay, so let's grant that you're right about all this. What's the upper limit? Let's grant that you're right, that society needs to make more accommodations for disabled people, that it doesn't treat them as well as it should. What's the point where we can say enough's enough? So, like, we build wheelchair ramps everywhere. Is that enough? Well, I think he would say no. So we make disabled parking everywhere. Is that enough? And again, he would say no. And my point is, practically speaking, is there an upper threshold? Is there a Terminator where we can say, okay, we as a society, we've accommodated disabled people enough, and if we go further than this point, then we're no longer accommodating them. We're making them a protected class. We're treating them special. We're treating them better than we are the other people who aren't disabled. So, like, a ridiculous example to kind of illustrate the point here is, I would think that if we as a society decided that everyone who's disabled gets a $100,000 check from the government every month, and all of their needs and housing is paid for, and they can just go do whatever they want with their life, well, that's very accommodating. But at that point, we've probably gone too far. That's fairly ridiculous. And I would think reasonable people could disagree as to where exactly the point is, where we would say that's a step too far. And I actually agreed with the guy giving this talk as to, well, we're nowhere close to where's too far yet. But I was trying to be the good, somewhat skeptical philosopher and say, okay, we're nowhere close to it, but where is the upper limit? Where's the Terminator? Where's the stop? Where's the point where we say, yeah, we've done enough for you, no more? And he couldn't really give me an answer, which told me he doesn't really have much of a solution to this problem. He's just talking about the problem. And to some extent, it's okay to just point out problems, but if you're going to be the one pointing out the problems, you've also got a responsibility to do your best to find a solution to it. And illustrative of that, when he gave his second talk at that conference there, which was about the same thing, problems people with disabilities have engaging with society, but he talked about it through some different angles and some different aspects of it there. Anyhow, at the end of that talk, the question I asked him is, so if I'm understanding you correctly, what you're saying is that when you get groups of people in committees, boards, etc., 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 there's a aspect there where the whole is more than the sum of its parts. Even if you get a bunch of people who have no malice toward people who have disabilities, who would help them if they saw them in the street, you get them all together in a committee and something changes and they're not so eager to help. They're going to be more resistant. He was like, yes, exactly. And I said to him, okay, well, at that time I was on 2 committees at the church my wife and I were attending, so I said, okay, then tell me, what can I do about it? Assuming you're right, assuming that everything you've said is true, and that's a problem, I'm on a committee or 2 at my church, what can I do about it? And he couldn't really give me an answer to that. I mean, he did respond. It's not like he ignored me, but he didn't really answer my question saying, okay, here's what you can do about it. Here's how you can fix that problem. Here's how you can take steps to address this. And what that strongly suggests to me is he hadn't actually thought through all the implications of how you deal with all these things. Because in many, many cases when you're talking about things like, well, how are we going to give disabled people access? There's trade-offs involved. You have to spend more money to build wheelchair access or disabled parking or, I forget the terminology, but the bathrooms that have stalls for people who are disabled that have bars around them and things like that. That costs more money. So that's money you can't spend elsewhere. Well, is that something you should do? I'd be inclined to say most of the time, yes. But suppose you were going to a very, very small church where nobody who attends the church is disabled. Is that a priority your church should make if none of the members or people who attend the church are disabled? Well, maybe not. And it seemed to me he just even hadn't really considered the fact that if you're going to make all these accommodations for disabled people, there are trade-offs where you're not going to have money and resources directed elsewhere. And the point I was trying to get at is, at a certain point, you're going to reach a threshold where those trade-offs are no longer worth it. And as I said, he was right to say that we're nowhere near that point in our society yet, but it seemed like he'd never even considered that there might be an upper limit, there might be a Terminator where we should say, this is enough, no more. And now this is a bit of a side note, but that's a recurring problem I've noticed, especially in more social studies academics and in philosophers who get into social issues. They'll have this problem happen fairly regularly where they'll detail and enunciate a certain problem to a large degree, but they won't have any solutions for it. They'll say, oh, we've got this huge problem with disability people not having access, with systematic racism, with on and on it goes. But when you say to them, okay, I grant you all that, what can we do about it? And they don't really have any answers for you as to what you can do about it. Well, that makes me kind of suspicious of them, because there is a good point in pointing out problems. In fact, that was one of Socrates' MOs, was he went around pointing out problems that everybody had in their viewpoints. But the purpose of pointing out problems is so that they can be corrected. The purpose of tearing down a decaying old building is so that you can put something better in its place. You can haul it all out of there, put a nice park there, build another building, something along those lines. To just tear something down for the sake of tearing it down is incredibly foolish. And it seems to me that at least some of the time, that's what these people are doing, is they're just trying to tear everything down, but not actually looking around for solutions. A classic example of that comes to mind, and I think this is from G.K. Chesterton, is he gave a kind of an analogical story of the foolishness of people who, upon buying a new piece of property somewhere out in the countryside, they go exploring and they come across a fence on their property that they don't know why it's there. The original owner didn't tell them anything about it. So they have no idea why the fence is there, so they decide, I'm going to tear it down. And he says, that's really stupid. That's very, very bad reasoning. You don't know why that fence is there. Therefore, what you should do is try to find out why it's there and then tear it down. For all you know, maybe it's like a fence to the neighbor's property and the neighbor has a really aggressive bull and the fence is keeping him contained. You tear down the fence, you're going to let that bull loose, it's going to go badly for you. Now, it could also be that the fence is there doing and accomplishing really nothing, that it's left over from, say, a previous owner who had animals there that he kept contained and now the animals are gone. It could also well be that the fence is there for some nefarious purpose. Maybe the previous owner hated his neighbor and put the fence there to tell his neighbor, keep out and leave me alone, in which case maybe you should tear the fence down. And so Chesterton's point here is, you come across a fence and you don't know why it's there. If your immediate reaction is tear it down, that's stupid. What you should do is find out why is it there, and then you can determine, should the fence be torn down? Should I leave it up? Should I build the fence higher? Should I make it lower? And on and on and on you go. And it's similar with many of these social issues. There are historical, sociological, in some cases philosophical, and maybe even theological reasons why various impediments exist. Some of them are due to things we as society have put in place. Some of them are due to things that nobody really has any control over, like the example of disabled people. For the most part, it's not really the case that we as society decided to make them disabled, or that somebody came along and decided, I want my child to be disabled. That's something that, for the most part, nobody really has any direct control over. So in the case of disabled people encountering a fence that prevents their full access to society, it seems pretty clear when you reflect upon it, that's a fence we should try and tear down, or at least make as low as we possibly can, as low as is reasonable, so that they can participate in society. But then, on the other hand, it might well be the case that for some of these other things, there's a very, very good reason why that fence is there and it shouldn't be torn down. So as an example of this, some people are advocating that we should legalize all or most drugs because there's so much violence and crime that's associated with the illegal drug trade, and it does really seem like economic forces drive that, and it's pretty difficult, if not impossible, to stand in the way of economic forces. So those people say, hey, there's a fence that's saying to people who are drug users, we don't want you to be a part of regular society. That fence is that drug use is, illicit drug use anyway, is for the most part illegal. So let's tear that fence down. Well, I would want to look at that and say, no, you haven't really thought this through, because illicit drug use, especially when you're talking about the harder drugs like cocaine and meth and things like that, it really does destroy people's bodies and lives. It's really, really, really harmful. There's essentially a good reason why societies put a fence there to say, that's not something you should do. That we want to make that option as unattractive to you as possible, because it hurts people, it destroys their lives. And so even if society tore down the fence that's saying, don't run off and start using cocaine and meth, well, maybe that would get rid of some of the violence and crime associated with the underground drug trade, but you'd still have people destroying their lives, and you'd have other social problems that would come up, and potentially even more so, although it's kind of hard to run an analysis like that. And so, for people who are, protesting various things, whether it be things like police brutality, systematic racism, or the many, many other protests that go on and happen in this country. People protest for and against abortion. People protest for and against certain political candidates and for and against political causes all the time. For all of these things, one of the things you need to keep in mind and look for is there a terminator for what these people are asking? That is there a point at which where they can say, we've got our goal, we can move on to other things? And abortion's an easy example of that, where it's very obvious that the two sides both have a terminator they're appealing to. For pro-life people, it's let's reduce and or eliminate abortions. Very obvious at which point they're satisfied and then they can go move on. For pro-choice people, it's a little more slippery, but still pretty obvious that what they're trying to do is say, let's keep abortion legal. Now, the reason I say it's a little more slippery is that would be kind of an ongoing fight, but it's still perfectly obvious terminator where they're saying, here's where we can say, enough's enough when abortion's legal. Now, in the case of at least some of the so-called protests and riots that are going on in the country, I would say that it's not really clear what the terminator is, or even if there is one. If you would ask people who are protesting and rioting, well, at what point, what political goal are you seeking? What law that could be passed? What new thing that could be done? What new social system that could be put in place? What reform would make you satisfied? Well, it's remarkably unclear, at least in many of those cases. It was similar, I think, I forget how long ago this was, 8 or 10 years ago, when the Occupy Wall Street people were a big deal during the last economic recession, where I worked for a guy who was very, very into that. He actually got arrested for a protest in Springfield because they tried to do an Occupy thing in Springfield that actually turned out to be rather pathetic. He was the manager at a place I was working at. And anyhow, I asked him, what are your goals? What are you guys trying to accomplish? What are some definite things that could be done that we could then point to and say, okay, this is going to do some good? And he couldn't really give me a straight answer. He pointed to the idea that they were going to have meetings in the future to determine what those goals should be. And this isn't always the case, but things like that, I think as a general rule, should make us kind of suspicious of the people involved. If they're pointing around yelling about problems, but then when you say to them, okay, I grant you all that, what can we do about it? And they can't really give you anything other than a vague answer, that's probably a sign they don't know very much about what they're talking about, or they just haven't really thought it through. Not all the time. There's some times where it's appropriate to say, I see a problem here, but I don't know what to do about it. And that's in and of itself fine. But if you're just running around yelling about all the problems involved, and then when somebody says, okay, theoretical case here, we put you in charge. What are you going to change to address this problem? And they can't really tell you anything, at least not anything that makes sense, probably a sign that they're more interested in just tearing the fence down than they are in thinking about things and trying to make things better. Now, logically speaking, the way this type of reasoning works, there's two errors that we're trying to avoid. The first is the error of infinite regress. Now, infinite regress is the idea that things go on and on back to infinity, which is a bad idea in logical, rational thinking. You don't want to go to that. So, easy example of this is that most arguments for the existence of God, at least most arguments for the existence of God from natural theology, appeal to the idea that you can't have infinite regress. So, variants of the cosmological argument, you can look to the idea that, well, the cause of Phil is his parents, the cause of Phil's parents is their parents, so on and so on and so on and so on, back forth, until you get to the first human being. Then if you buy into evolutionary theory, you can go back further and further with life until you get to the first life. You can go from first life back to the various chemical and molecular reactions, and so on and so on and so on, back forth until you get to the very first instance of the universe, Big Bang. There's a causal chain that you can point to for all that. Well, what's the first cause? You either have to have a first cause or you have to have infinite regress. Since infinite regress is bad, it's impossible, you want to avoid that, then for the first cause you want to look to something, and typically the best explanation is God or something very, very much like him. And that's a very, very loose explanation of how cosmological arguments work. They appeal to various different aspects of the universe and causality and different things, but the general idea is infinite regress is bad, you want to avoid that. And it's similar when I'm talking about the need for a terminator in these types of things. There you're not looking to avoid infinite regress as much as you are trying to say, here's a point at which we can say, stop, that's enough, no more. The other logical fallacy that you're looking to avoid is something that's called the taxicab fallacy. And that's where you don't take the chain of causation back as far as you should go. You stop at the point you're comfortable with. So suppose somebody's on trial for murder and the victim was killed by stabbing, and the prosecutor has got the accused murderer on the stand and gets the murderer to admit, yeah, that person was killed by a knife. And then the prosecutor's like, well, who used the knife? Who stabbed him? And the guy's like, oh no, nobody used the knife. He was just killed by a knife. Well, you'd go, what? That doesn't make sense. Knives don't just stab people. Well, that's the taxicab fallacy, essentially. The accused murderer there is stopping his explanation at the knife and not taking the very, very obvious and necessary next step of saying, well, who was holding the knife? And in that case, we have good cause to suspect, well, he was holding the knife because he's using bad reasoning. And seemingly on purpose to try to avoid punishment for the murder in that case. And that's what the taxicab fallacy is you stop the chain of reasoning at the point where you want to stop it, rather than going as far as the question you're asking demands. So it's not always necessarily the case that simply stopping the chain of reasoning somewhere means you've committed the taxicab fallacy. It's more dependent on the question you're asking or looking for. So I know NASA's trying to send people to the moon, not the moon, Mars sometime in the next, I forget the exact timeline, but I think like 5 to 10 years. Let's suppose when the astronauts get to Mars, they find wreckage and machinery that doesn't look like it was made on Earth. Well, they're justified there in looking at that and saying, an intelligent agent made this. Probably aliens, or maybe a civilization that used to live on Mars but has now gone extinct, or maybe some other humans somehow made it to Mars before we got here and we just have no record or knowledge of that. But they're probably justified in inferring, if they find machinery and wreckage and things like that, that an intelligent agent made that and somehow it got left on Mars. Now, they don't necessarily have to answer the question of whence from did that intelligent agent come in order to make that inference. It's a justified inference because the question there is not what is the ultimate cause of that intelligence, it's why is there this wreckage and machinery here on Mars? And the obvious answer would be some kind of intelligent agent of some kind made it and somehow it got left there. So the point I'm making there is a Terminator is somewhat, at least, context dependent on the type of question you're asking, on the type of answer you're looking for. If you are looking for the ultimate metaphysical and ontological explanation for everything, well, then you would, the astronauts would in that circumstance have to go around and say, well, whence from did this intelligent agent come? How did they get here? They'd have to follow the chain of reasoning all the way back, but you don't necessarily have to do that all the time. It depends on what type of reasoning you're doing, what type of explanation you're looking for, what type of question you're asking. Likewise, in a murder trial, you don't have to solve the question of, well, how did human beings get here in the first place in order to establish, yeah, that guy that was holding the knife committed the murder. He's the murderer and we should punish him. Because you're only asking the question of, how did this murder occur and who's responsible, not whence from did anything come. Now, this ties a little bit back into the second to last episode I did on the problems with presuppositionalism, but that's part of the problem there of presuppositionalism is they kind of are maybe not quite ignoring, but flipping back and forth between the question of, well, what is the ultimate explanation for everything and what's the relevant explanation for what we're looking for right now. I had an interaction with somebody who subscribes to that type of thinking on Facebook a while back, and she kept saying, hey, what's the basis for reasoning? How do you justify this? And she was trying to get me to essentially push me to say, well, it's in God, and you've got to assume God to get reasoning going. And I was pushing back saying, well, no, that's not necessarily the case, because depending on what you're looking for and arguing and asking about, it could well be the case that there's not one single basis, not one thing alone that's the ultimate you're appealing to. And even if it is, it could well be the case that one ultimate, you've got other justifications for it. You don't just have to assume things wholesale to get started like presuppositionalism thinks. So the example I use there is, if you're trying to think about theories about how and why are the pyramids in Egypt there in Egypt, well, there's a number of competing theories. The most obvious one is the ancient Egyptians built them a relatively long time period ago. Other people have theories like aliens did it. Other people have theories like a previously unknown civilization built them a very, very long time ago, and then the Egyptians came along later and modified them and claimed credit for something that they didn't really do. And there are other theories as well. And so what I said to her is, when I make the claim the Egyptians built the pyramids a relatively long time ago, I'm not just appealing to one thing. I'm appealing to all kinds of different things. I'm appealing to logical coherence of a theory. I'm appealing to the fact that the theory fits with the background knowledge I have. I'm appealing to physical evidence from historical records, archaeology, and so on and so forth. I'm appealing to good rational reasoning in the idea that other theories, we would expect them to leave behind some evidence. We don't see that evidence, therefore they're not very good theories. And this is a weaker type of reasoning than strong deductive reasoning. But my point I was making is, I'm not appealing to one ultimate thing. I'm appealing to multiple different things. Therefore, I'm not appealing to one ultimate. Therefore, it's not this type of reasoning, which is abduction or inference to the best explanation, is not susceptible to your claim that we all got to appeal to one ultimate and you just have to accept that as if it's an unprovable axiom. But the further problem is that even if it is the case that you're using, say, a more deductive type of reasoning that appeals to, one thing, it's not really the case that you're then left saying, well, this is the axiom I start with, I can't prove it, therefore we've all just got to start with our axioms. Rather, you can actually look around and see, well, who's got better axioms? What's a better starting position than another one? For example, any starting point that accepts the three basic laws of logic, as pretty well articulated by Aristotle, is inherently superior to any starting point that doesn't accept that. And that's because the collective experience of the vast majority of humanity, and my own observations and your observations as well, pretty much everybody's observations, is those three basic rules of logic are valid. They work all the time that we've ever looked for them. And virtually everyone agrees with that, except for a few people who we have cause to suspect are not really telling us the truth about what they observe when they argue against things like the basic rules of logic. Therefore, a man who comes along and says, my starting axiom rejects Aristotle's three basic rules of logic, that's an inherently inferior starting position to one that does accept those. So it's not like we're just left choosing which axiom we start with, as the presuppositionalists think. So at least in a certain sense, and this is aside from the problems I pointed out with this type of reasoning before, presuppositionalism is confusing the types of questions we're asking. That is, it's not recognizing there's an important distinction between, well, am I asking, what is the ultimate answer to everything? What's the source of the first cause, even causally speaking, before the Big Bang, as opposed to the question of, well, who committed this murder? You don't have to necessarily go back to the very, very first cause of the universe in order to answer the question, who committed that murder and what evidence do we have for it? And confusing and conflating those two just doesn't really work. It's a bad way of thinking. As I'm saying this, I kind of wish I'd had that explanation of this as I was doing that podcast, because I think it's probably a little bit clearer and easier for people who aren't steeped in epistemology to understand than the distinction I did use between the epistemological and the ontological, because this is really just a better way of saying that. You don't have to look to the very, very, very first cause of the universe, that is, the ontological or metaphysical, in order to answer the question, well, who murdered this guy and what's our evidence for it, which is more epistemological. Another example of this, which is probably a little bit more out of left field than the other ones I've used, but there's a very, very popular idea in philosophy of religion these days called skeptical theism. And it's actually a fairly good idea that at bedrock, at its foundation, it does have a very, very good point. And roughly speaking, skeptical theism is the idea that any god worth being called God, any god who's omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient, and so on and so forth, any god like that, he will have reasons for doing things that we simply could not comprehend, understand, even if he wanted to explain them to us. And I hope you can see that just simply seems to follow that, of course, a god who's that much infinitely more above us than we are of the ants, well, of course he's going to have reasons for things that we can't comprehend and understand. And so skeptical theism says, Well, therefore, you're not rationally justified in saying any instance of evil is evidence against God. Because it could well be the case that God being God, he has reasons and justifications that you can't even begin to comprehend, but that are very, very good and valid. And there's certainly a point there. There is. But there's also a problem, which is there doesn't seem to be, at least inherently, any Terminator where you can stop and say, well, yeah, but come on, this is way too much evil. There's something so horribly wrong here that's prima facie incompatible with God being good. There isn't a Terminator where we can say, yeah, here, but not more. There doesn't seem to be, at least in that theory alone, an obvious Terminator, an obvious endpoint where we can say, yeah, I can see how it does me good when I cut myself with a knife because I was being careless, so that pain does me good. Therefore, God's justified in giving me that pain because it'll prevent me from being careless in the future. Having pain will help me be more empathetic with other people and realize why I should be empathetic and not go around hurting them. So yeah, that makes sense. But then if something like a giant meteor cruises out of the sky and hits the Earth and kills 100 million people and plunges the world into essentially a nuclear winter where 1 billion people die of starvation, well, intuitively I would want to think that's much, much more wrong. And yes, under skeptical theism, God could have good reasons for that, but shouldn't I be able to say there's something more wrong with the giant meteor than there is with me cutting my finger? And skeptical theism in and of itself doesn't really allow for you to put a Terminator in there, so if you buy into it wholesale, you essentially have to abandon your own moral reasoning as far as whether what's happening to you is good or not, because God could well have very, very good reasons for everything that happens to you, and all you're left to be able to do is look around and say, yeah, that looks really evil, but God works in mysterious ways, his wonders to behold. And that's a very clear problem, because we should be able to, at least somewhat, most of the time, trust our own moral reasoning to look at things and say, that's wrong, and that's right. Now, I've actually got a book on skeptical theism that I'm planning on working my way through, and I think it's still possible you could make something like that work if you found some other reason to bring in some type of a Terminator there, something where you can say, yeah, that far, but no further. If you don't have that Terminator, then there's something clearly wrong with skeptical theism, even though at its foundation it definitely has a good point. And really that's the case with most ideas that are bad, that run out of control, are things that have a good point somewhere at its foundation, but there's no obvious Terminator where you can say this far and no further. As I talked about last week, the problems with postmodern language theory and things like that, well, at its foundation, postmodern language theory does have a point, which is we're all inferring, not deducing what meaning is, therefore we can get it wrong. That's a really good point, and it is helpful to keep that in mind, that I could be wrong, you could be wrong, we could all be wrong, and we're all wise to think about that. But what the postmodernists did is run with that way too far, because they didn't find, at least they didn't see any obvious Terminator, and say everything's in flux, all meaning is relative, which quite clearly it is not. That's a self-contradictory position. And many political ideas are like that as well. Historically speaking, the role of the political left in America has been to try to push society to include more people. Since all human systems are necessarily imperfect, we always wind up excluding people, and the role of the political left has been to push at society and say, you're leaving these people out. Why are you doing this? Include them. And that, at least in theory, can make society more just because it gets more people included, or at the least, makes society justify why it's excluding those people. Easy example that I think I've used before when talking to people is, well, it's very, very obvious why, say, serial killers should be excluded from regular society. There's a very, very good reason for that. And even if the political left was pushing, saying, you need to include them, I think we'd be justified in pushing back, saying, no, we're justified in locking people like that up. But it's not so much the case that for, say, ethnic and political minorities, why they shouldn't be included. And when the political left has pushed in favor of those people, it's for the most part made society more just, at least generally speaking. But a problem that I think we're now starting to see with the political left is that they haven't put a Terminator in there to say, yeah, we need to stop including people at this point. They kept pushing and pushing and pushing to include people, even those people who are basically undermining the very society that they want to include. And there you get a problem because it makes things unstable. And likewise, you can wind up with a similar problem on the right, where the political right is, the conservatives have generally been more like, well, we need to keep things stable. We need to keep the same system we have, because human beings do need some stability in our lives. We need things to be at least somewhat the same day to day. And so that's generally been the role of the conservatives and the political right, is keep things the same unless you can give me a very, very good reason why we should change it, and then we'll change it. Well, it's very obvious that that can go too far too, where even when there's a very, very good reason why you should change things, why, as the left would say, these people need to be included, the conservatives and the political right are saying, no, don't include them. I don't care how many good arguments you give me, you can't include them. So that can go too far in the other way as well. So that's some practical examples of this problem. The main point I'm trying to make is, for the most part, when somebody's advocating an idea, position, political theory, philosophical theory, or whatever like that to you, and there isn't an obvious point at which you can say, stop, that's enough, there isn't an obvious point at which you can say that's been satisfied, there's probably something wrong with it. There needs to be a Terminator in things. And the only exception of that, as best as I can tell, is when you're asking questions about the ultimate, when you're asking questions like, well, what is the first cause? When you're asking those ontological and metaphysical questions, then it's perfectly appropriate to try to run things back as far as you can. But even there, you want to avoid infinite regress, and usually the Terminator you're going to run into is God or something very, very much like him. So, for the most part, when people are talking to you about their philosophical, religious, political system, or any other thing like that, I think it's very, very helpful and appropriate to try to ask them questions about, well, what's your answer? What's the Terminator? Where's the point where the problem you're pointing out will be satisfied? And if they can't give you an answer, I think you're probably justified in being suspicious of them. Not all the time. This is a rule of thumb. It's not a hard and fast rule. But for the most part, when somebody's saying, this group of people isn't being treated justly, and you say to them, okay, how do we treat them justly? What can we do? And their response is, I don't know, but they're not being treated justly. Yeah, I'd say you probably need to be a little suspicious of them at that point. So that's a rough overview on what I've termed the use of Terminators in reasoning. This idea actually takes, as best as I can tell, several different forms. Other philosophers have called it different things, but I just think Terminators is a useful phrase to understand this type of reasoning, where there has to be a point at which it stops. And besides, I got to make a reference to the Terminator series this way, and that's fun. So, what do you think about all this? Write in, let me know what you think. You can reach me for any kind of comment at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com. Very soon these days, I hope to get back to updating the Facebook page, and that's The Examined Life with Phil. Just type it in on Facebook and you can find it. And as always, if you like what I'm doing here, give me a like or a rating or whatever is appropriate on the podcast app you use, and share it with other people. And I will be back again in 2 weeks' time with something else for you.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
To a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.